And good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me once again. It's very nice to see you. For those of you who are new to the Satsang, I'm Hari-kirtana, and thank you very much for joining me this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can hear me. Please indicate that this is, in fact, the case by raising your hands. Thank you very, very much. All right, now that we have established that little bit of housekeeping, let us once again go through the rest of our housekeeping. You can adjust your audio settings as well as your viewing options. Odds are you can find the controls for that in the upper right-hand corner. You need not be concerned with your own microphone or video camera on your computer. You can see me and hear me. I cannot see or hear you, but if you type something into the Q&A box, I will see that you are asking for my attention with a comment or a question. So if any of you would like to go ahead and just pop a question, a rhetorical question. I don't feel like answering a real question yet. And that way we'll know that you know where the Q&A box is and I can see your questions. Last week, chapter 5, The Art of Letting Go. We spoke about being the non-doer of activities, how we are actually not responsible for the actions that we think we are causing to happen. Hi, Mary. Thank you for just arriving. And we will speak a little bit more about this strange idea because it looks like we're doing stuff. It looks like things are happening as a result of our doing stuff. How can we say that we are not the doers of activities? Why is Krishna giving us this very counterintuitive idea? We'll talk a little bit more about that and get a little more clarity on that as we move into tonight's verses. We also talked about the metaphor of the lotus leaf that comes up from the muddy water and yet is untouched by either mud or water. Actually rises above and can move through, is simultaneously in the water but not touched by the water, our metaphor for how we move through the world from a position of knowledge without actually being affected by the world in quite the same way as we are affected when we are under the influence of the world, or specifically the qualities of material nature of which the world is made. And then being in a city with 9 gates, we spoke about the idea of our bodies as being like a city with 9 gates, and how we are the person, kind of a controller, kind of a master of the body, in that in most cases we can will something and then the body does what we will. And we'll also talk a little bit more about this relationship between the self and the body, circling back to that idea once again. Neela Madhava would like to hear more about how we're not responsible, especially in relation to karma. We will talk a little bit about that and how it is that we can be responsible for our karma while not being the one who generates the actions that produce karma. You may recall earlier on, Krishna said that action is a great mystery. It's really, really hard to understand what action is, how action works, what's an action that's good to perform, what's an action that's actually going to get you a bad reaction, how to act in such a way so that it's to produce no reaction whatsoever. So tonight, we're going to look at this very crazy idea that not only are we not the ones that are generating action and causing the results of our actions to come about, but we are responsible for the results of the actions that we're not creating or engaged in doing. Sounds crazy, right? Well, let's just see how crazy it is. All right, so tonight, the results of letting go or not, we're going to talk about how Krishna is unaffected by the actions of others. Earlier, we heard how he is not obliged to act, and yet he does, but he is free from any kind of karmic obligations. There is no reaction to his actions. He is not particularly obliged or forced in any way to act in any particular way. He has no psychological predispositions. He's completely independent and free to act as he chooses. We, by the way, do not have quite that same capacity for freedom in action. We'll talk a little bit about ignorance and knowledge, the distinction between the two, another way to understand more deeply the distinction between the two and the results of the two, and a very, very important and famous verse in the Bhagavad-gita about seeing with equal vision. So tonight we'll cover verses 14 through 19 in chapter 5 of the Bhagavad-gita. But first, we say goodbye to the village voice. Now, if you are not from New York City, then this may not be quite as significant to you. Or if you are significantly younger than I am, then this might not be significant to you. But there was a story in the New York Times just the other day, a kind of a requiem for the village voice, which was the alternative news weekly, the original alternative news weekly that has been published in New York City since the mid to late 1950s. And when I read the story, it talked about not just how the internet has undone or been the cause of print publications to be losing money, going out of business and such like that. It was really more about the significance of the village voice as a representation of New York City as a place of radical ideas, a particular part of the character of New York City for a very long time. Much of the time when I was living in New York City. And even though I was raised on Long Island, I don't really identify as a Long Islander. And I don't think I speak very much as a Long Islander. I identify with New York City. I was born there. I bolted back into the city first chance I got when I was done living in my parents' home. And a lot of my own sense of identity is tied up in New York City, but not just in New York City. In New York City, the way it was when I was there, or when I was growing up and coming into the city, when I was living in the city. And I miss New York City. I would like to go back to New York City, but the New York City that I miss isn't there anymore. If you're lucky, you will live long enough to see your world disappear right before your eyes. It's a weird thing to see this happen. And so I was feeling sad that I am attached to this particular identity, and I'm attached to this particular place, and I identify with it, and it's gone. At least most of it is gone. So it made me think back to a verse that we covered earlier, which is this one: that which is temporal has no real substance, whereas that which is truly real is eternal and changeless. Seers of the truth have reached this conclusion by studying the nature of both. So we've been speaking about letting go. And this has been my personal challenge this week, with another element of the city I identify with disappearing, proving that it actually had no real substance in the first place, at least as far as the Bhagavad-gita is concerned. It tells me that my sense of identity, in one sense, valid though it may be in one way, has no real substance in another way. It is a product of my own sense of misidentification with this temporary material body that just happened to be born in New York, and therefore thinks, I am a New Yorker. I love New York. New York's the greatest place. And what's funny is everybody thinks that about wherever they come from. Well, Andy Warhol didn't. He came to New York City because, according to Andy Warhol, small towns exist so that they provide you a place to leave. And I even saw Andy Warhol once, just on account of being in New York City. Oops. Last week. That's not last week. That's for tonight. One of these days I'll get this right. Oh no, that was last week. Wait a minute, I did get this right. I confused myself. Here we go. So last week, here's where we left off. Bhagavad-gita 5:13. Mentally renouncing all actions, an embodied master of the senses lives happily within the city of 9 gates, neither acting nor causing actions to occur. So this is our crazy proposition. The idea that once we realize or understand that we are not the cause of action, we are not the ones that are acting, etc., we become happy. How is that possible? Or how does that make sense exactly? So this next section of verses, hopefully, will help make some sense out of this radical proposition. So I'm going to read through tonight's verses, and then we'll go back through each verse individually and look at them more closely. And of course, one of these verses will be our verse to chant this evening. So, chapter 5, verse 14. The master of this city does not create activities, does not induce people to act, and does not connect actions to their results. All of this is set into motion by the conditioning of material nature. Nor does the Supreme Lord accept responsibility for anyone's virtuous or evil deeds. All living beings are bewildered by the ignorance that covers their knowledge. Verse 16. But those whose nescience has been destroyed by knowledge experience enlightenment. Just as the shining sun reveals everything in the daytime, this same knowledge illuminates the highest truth. Verse 17. Those whose intelligence is focused on the Supreme, whose mind is absorbed in the Supreme, whose faith is fully vested in the Supreme, and who have accepted the Supreme as their only shelter, are cleansed of impieties by virtue of complete knowledge. Thus they go to that place from which one need not return. Verse 18. Endowed with humility and knowledge, the wise see a learned and gentle Brahmin, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and one who eats dogs with equal vision. Even, text 19, even here in this world, those whose minds are fixed in impartiality, seeing all as equal, conquer birth and death. As the absolute truth is flawless and forever the same, they too are established in the absolute truth. All right. So those are our verses for this evening. And now we'll go back over each of these verses individually. So once again, text 14. The master of this city, that is to say, the city of 9 gates, the body, does not create activities, does not induce people to act, and does not connect actions to their results. All of this is set into motion by the conditioning of material nature. The word that's used for, that I've translated as master of this city, in this verse, the Sanskrit word is Prabhu. Prabhu can mean someone who's in charge of something, or someone who is the master of something. In most yoga philosophy, most books of yoga philosophy, Prabhu is a Sanskrit term usually used to indicate the supreme person, Ishvara, or Paramatma, that is to say, the super soul residing within the heart of all living beings, as opposed to the living being who resides in the body. And even within the tradition from which I'm drawing my understanding of the Bhagavad-gita, we find that different teachers will choose one or the other. So some will say this Prabhu refers to the living entity, who is the master of the senses, the person who is experiencing through the agency or the medium of this physical body. And then others will interpret that same word as indicating the Supreme Lord, the Paramatma within the heart. Does not create activities, does not induce people to act, and does not connect actions to their results. So these are both true. You can, as far as I can see, interpret this word in either way in this particular case and still have a true statement. In the next verse, however, Krishna is specifically speaking about the supersoul, or the Paramatma, the supreme person within the heart. That verse, once again, verse 15, nor does the Supreme Lord accept responsibility for anyone's virtuous or evil deeds. All living beings are bewildered by the ignorance that covers their knowledge. So let's break this up into 2 parts. The first line, nor does the Supreme Lord accept responsibility for anyone's virtuous or evil deeds. So there's a couple of ways that we can understand this. One is that those deeds don't affect the Supreme Lord. No big surprise there. But the other understanding, I think, is probably more important. The Supreme Lord does not create a particular situation for any living entity. The living entity, you and I, are the ones who are responsible for the creation of whatever situation we're in. So here's the far out part about this. If I'm not the one who creates, who is responsible for the results of actions, I'm not connecting the results to the action or the action to the result. I'm not creating action. I am not causing anyone else to act. It seems like I'm not actually doing anything. And the explanation is that the qualities of material nature that condition me to be a particular way, well, those are acting. Are they acting on autopilot by themselves? No. Because the supreme controller or master is the Paramatma, the Supreme Lord within the heart. So the modes or qualities of material nature that I'm conditioned by are ultimately under the control of the Paramatma. So does that mean that I should blame God for what's happening to me? I mean, it's not my fault. I'm not doing anything. The modes of material nature, the qualities of material nature are doing everything. I don't control them, but somebody does, and that person is the Supreme Being. So therefore, all my problems are on account of God did this to me. Not my fault. I'm just an innocent victim. Well, one could think like that. Except here, Krishna is saying the Supreme Lord doesn't accept responsibility for what happens to me. It's not his fault either. This is so confusing. No wonder Arjuna doesn't get it yet. So here's what happens. An individual living being like me is bewildered by my association with the three qualities of material nature. And I think that I'm the one who's causing action. But the only thing I actually generate are desires. I can have a desire. And how is that desire going to be fulfilled? Well, the desire is fulfilled by Param Atma. The Supreme Person within the heart is known as the one who fulfills all desires. Remember earlier, we heard the verse where Krishna says, as they approach me, I reciprocate with them in precisely that way. So if one approaches the world from a position of ignorance, not knowing, being bewildered, in a state of illusion, what I'm doing, if that's my condition, is I'm approaching Krishna from a state of illusion. Or to be more specific, I am approaching Krishna's energies in the form of these three qualities of material nature that I am identifying with and that I think I can move in such a way as to fulfill my desire. When actually the fulfillment of my desire through the qualities of material nature is coming from the Paramatma, the Supreme Person. And because it's my desire that things move a particular way, I am responsible for the reaction to the fulfillment of my desire. Because it wasn't Paramatma's desire, it was mine. And that's what I'm responsible for, and that's what I'm capable of doing. Think of it like this. You may have had the experience of a child who wants, a little child, who wants to lift something that is much heavier than they can lift. But they have a desire to lift it. So some kindly adult may assist and say, okay, try real hard, lift it up. And then without the child quite understanding what's happening, the adult is actually the one who's doing the lifting. And then when the object is lifted, then the adult says, see, you did it. That's great. And the child is very proud and thinks, I did that. It's kind of like that. We cannot move the universe. The qualities of material nature are just too heavy. But we have this desire to move the world into alignment with our desires. That's our primary desire, is to have our desires fulfilled. So if this is how we approach Krishna, Krishna reciprocates with us in precisely that way, by fulfilling our desire relative to the amount in which we deserve to have our desire fulfilled, or in a particular way that abides by the laws of nature, in other words, our karma. So this gets to the question of how are we responsible or not responsible for our karma? We are responsible for our karma because our karma is the reaction to the actions that were set in motion by virtue of our desire. And we can think of yoga, and particularly bhakti yoga, which Krishna keeps coming back to, as the science of purification of desire. So we can think about that for just a moment. What are our desires? Who is the person who stands to benefit from the fulfillment of our desires? Are our desires for ourselves? Are our desires for extensions of ourselves in the form of family members or community or society or nation? How can we reorient our desires in order to be lifted out of the condition of illusion, out of the obligation to experience the reactions to our actions? We don't often hear this, but this is where Krishna is going with this. The idea of yoga as the purification of desire, purification of the heart, basically. So if you have any questions so far about what I've been talking about, please go ahead and pop them into the Q&A box. And I'll keep an eye out for your questions as we move on to the second part of this verse, which is all living beings are bewildered by the ignorance that covers their knowledge. So this is also a kind of mystical phrase, because remember, ignorance is the absence of knowledge, or from the word avidya, the absence of light, the absence of illumination. Knowledge, in this case, I believe the word was jnana, but indicates that you can see, And in the next verse, Krishna will make it clear by use of the analogy of the shining sun that illuminates everything in the daytime. So ignorance is an absence of knowledge that covers knowledge. That to me is pretty wild, to try to visualize an absence of something that covers the thing that is absent. I'm pointing this out just because I'm having fun sitting with that and just sort of hanging out with it as a concept, and therefore I thought you might as well. It's just kind of an interesting way to think about the relationship of ignorance and knowledge. All right, Jessica's got a question. This section is actually pretty confusing. I feel like I might be helped by comparing a few different translations. Then again, I think they are pretty different here, so maybe that is more confusing. If you compare translations from within a particular school of thought, within the overarching, overall possible translations, because there are hundreds of translations of the Bhagavad-gita, and they come from teachers in different lineages, therefore there's a different understanding. So, for example, if you were to look at a translation and commentary by someone in a Vaishnava or personalist theistic kind of school of philosophy, which is the school of philosophy I'm drawing from, and you looked at, say, 4 or 5 different translations from within that one school, then you would probably get more information. It would be less confusing because you'd have several different commentaries that you can compare that are kind of complementary, because they all operate from what in Sanskrit is known as the same siddhanta, or ultimate philosophical conclusion. On the other hand, if you were to look at translations from teachers coming in a lineage that had a absolute non-dualistic interpretation, and you put it side by side with a Vaishnava or personalist interpretation, then you could be confused, because now you're looking at translations from people who subscribe to different ultimate philosophical conclusions or siddhantas. It's almost like looking at the same thing from 2 different worldviews. They're not going to be easily reconciled. So, my suggestion is to look at a few different translations, but make sure you know what the where the author is coming from. This you can probably find out in the introduction. This, by the way, is what I do to render my translations. I have like 5 or 6 different editions of the Bhagavad-gita out, and I look back and forth between each of them, and I look at the word-for-word translations from those editions that have them. And then I will take a peek at a few other translations that I know are from outside the school of thought I'm working from, just for the sake of comparison, just to see if there's any significant difference in the actual translation as opposed to the interpretation. The place where it'll get confusing, odds are, is in the commentary, unless an interpretation is built directly into the translation, which does happen in plenty of instances. Anyway, so Jessica, I hope that's helpful. in terms of how you can gain a deeper understanding by looking at several different translations and comparing them. Because you're absolutely right. This is a pretty esoteric portion of the Bhagavad-gita that we're in. And therefore, no one should be surprised if we find it challenging. All right, so we'll move on to the next verse. This is verse 16. But those whose nescience, ignorance, has been destroyed by knowledge, experience enlightenment. So this is also a very colorful and interesting way to think about this. Here we have an absence of something being destroyed. Krishna's language here, and this is a really good reason to look at a variety of translations, to see how different Sanskrit scholars or experts in one way or another translate Krishna's choice of words. As a general rule, I use what I consider to be a consensus opinion. So here we have this idea, nescience, or the absence of knowledge, is destroyed by knowledge. So anyway, I just think this is also a very far out kind of psychedelic concept. And such people experience enlightenment. Then Krishna gives the example that I referred to just a moment ago. Just as the shining sun reveals everything in the daytime, this same knowledge illuminates the highest truth. So, what is the highest truth? The highest truth is a complete understanding of reality, of who we are, what the world is, where the world comes from, why the world exists, from whom does the world emanate, what are the relationships between all these different players. Here's a way to break down this section into what I hope is a relatively simple understanding for a complex set of ideas. We can think of three doers involved in action. And seeing this is the truth that gets illuminated by a proper understanding or knowledge. First is the individual being, you and I. And we are the doer only in the sense that we have desires. So those are actually generated by us. Then the second doer is material nature, which is the medium, the vehicle through which action occurs and results of actions are delivered. And then the third doer is universal being, Paramatma. Remember, there are innumerable living individual beings like you and I, but there is only one universal being, Paramatma, who is locally situated within the heart of each and every individual being. But it's the same person in my heart as your heart and everyone else's heart. And that person is the fulfiller of the desires of the individual being through the agency or vehicle of material nature. So, three actors. We can think of it like that. Verse 17. Those whose intelligence is focused on the Supreme, whose mind is absorbed in the Supreme, whose faith is fully vested in the Supreme, and who have accepted the Supreme as their only shelter are cleansed of impieties by virtue of complete knowledge. So there you go, 4 parts. Intelligence focused on the Supreme. Later on in the Bhagavad-gita, we will hear that Krishna considers the study of the Bhagavad-gita worship of the Supreme Person by way of intelligence. So simply this study, trying to understand this complex subject matter with one's intelligence, is focusing the intelligence on the Supreme. Remember, the words or the teachings of the Supreme Person are, in a sense, not different from the Supreme Person. Just as the name of the Supreme Person is considered to be a transcendental sound, the teachings of the Supreme Person are also considered to be Shabda Brahman, or God in the form of sound, is the simple translation of Shabda Brahman. The sound incarnation of the absolute truth. So when we try to understand this sound by our intelligence, then our intelligence is focused on the Supreme, whose mind is absorbed in the Supreme. In other words, one who makes the Supreme their object of meditation. We are about to segue into the mystic yoga process described by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras. So these verses that we're looking at right now are seed verses or prelude verses to the upcoming verses where Krishna will make a transition from karma yoga to mystic yoga, the yoga of meditation. Whose faith is fully vested in the Supreme. Faith is the mandatory prerequisite for knowledge. And here, Krishna is making that statement, that faith in the Supreme Person. What do we mean by faith? You could think of it as faith that the Supreme Person has our best interests at heart, which is to say this Shabda Brahman, this sound vibration, this knowledge that is being shared with us through the medium of the Bhagavad-gita is being spoken for our benefit. So we can start with faith in the intention of the Supreme Person to help us. And as we act on the knowledge that we receive and understand, we find reason to place even more and greater, increasing faith in the source of that knowledge. And who have accepted the Supreme as their only shelter. The ultimate philosophical conclusion of the Bhagavad-gita, in accordance with the particular line of teachings I'm drawing from as I share these teachings with you, is that the ultimate dharma, that is the ultimate righteousness, is this: to take shelter of the Supreme Person, or to turn to that Supreme Person as the ultimate shelter. Think of it like this. The qualities of material nature are the energies of the Supreme Person, and they're controlled by the Supreme Person. And we look to some aspect of these qualities of material nature as the place where we want to reside, where we will find our happiness, our ultimate satisfaction. And Because unlike Brahman, unlike the absolute truth, the three qualities of material nature are constantly in motion, constantly changing. They will not ever really provide us with that ultimate shelter and that ultimate satisfaction that we naturally seek. Which is why, even if I were able to go back to the New York City that's not there anymore, it wouldn't be everything I imagine it was. It wouldn't satisfy me in the way I like to believe that it would. And it's gone. Just like everything else that is a product of the three qualities of material nature. Now you see it, now you don't. The one constant is the Supreme Person. And the dormant relationship that we have with the Supreme Person, that can be reawoken at any time through the process of the purification of our desires. All right. So 4 things: intelligence focused on the Supreme, trying to understand with our intelligence the nature of the Supreme Person, making the Supreme Person our object of meditation, fully vesting our faith in the Supreme Person, and turning to the Supreme Person for shelter. Remember, once again, as they approach me, I reciprocate with them in exactly that way. If we think that the material world is a storm and we want an umbrella, the ultimate umbrella is the Supreme Person. Okay, so those 4 things, the result is we are cleansed of impieties, which is to say our karma just slides off of us by virtue of complete knowledge. So these 4 things constitute complete knowledge and bring about complete knowledge. Thus, they go to that place from which one need not return. The place need not return indicates freedom from the cycle of birth and death. In other words, one is no longer obliged to take birth in a material body in the material world, liberated. One may, as a service, voluntarily do so, but the obligation is no longer there. We're forced to take birth in accordance with our karma. It's not a choice. And freedom from that obligation comes about from complete knowledge. Complete knowledge is arrived at by these 4 engagements. All right. Which brings us to verse 18, which is the verse that we will chant this evening. There we go. All right. I chant, you chant back. I'll do it 1 line at a time. You chant back the quarter verses. For those of you who are new, the bar over the A indicates a long, open sounding A. The apostrophe over the S is an SH sound all the way in the back of one's mouth, and the dot under the H at the end of a line at the end of a word means we echo the vowel that precedes it back. So I chant, you chant back. Vidya Vinaya Sampanne Brahmane Gavihastini Shunni Chaiva Shvapake Cha pandita samadharshinaha. Samadarshana, darshan, like drishti, seeing, sama, equal. Pandit, like a pundit, someone who knows something. Endowed with humility and knowledge, the wise see a learned and gentle Brahmin, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and one who eats dogs with equal vision. And normally I translate every word. I left Brahman in there. Brahmana is a person who is has the characteristics of being both learned and gentle. You could say they are a spiritually enlightened intellectual, as opposed to a materially accomplished academic. Their learning is primarily in the category of transcendental knowledge. And obviously, being in a different body, a Brahmin, any person, is different from a cow, or a cow is different from an elephant, and an elephant is different from a dog, and certainly one who eats dogs is different from a Brahmin. Eating a dog is usually a symptom of the absence of learning and someone who is not a friend to all living beings. And yet, someone who is endowed with these qualities of humility and knowledge sees all of these different beings as equal. So in what way equal? Two ways. First, all living beings are spiritual beings, which is to say, the actual person within the body is not the body. Different people take on different bodies according to their karma, and their expression of their desires takes on different appearances according to the set of senses that has been organized around their consciousness in the particular form they've taken. But the person inside the body who identifies as being a cow, an elephant, or a dog is of the same spiritual quality as the Brahmin or the person who eats dogs. The other attribute is that the supreme person, Paramatma, is within the heart of each of those beings. And a person who sees things as they are sees two people residing in each body: the individual living being and the same supreme being who is in everyone's body, both residing within the heart. And therefore, such a person treats everyone equally, but that doesn't mean that we act the same way toward them. So for example, if we come in contact with someone who is very spiritually advanced, then we treat them with the utmost respect and we offer them service, and hopefully if they're kind to us, they will help us to make further advancement in our own spiritual lives. When we come in contact with a colleague, a peer, someone who is also like us, engaged in trying to understand the path of spiritual life, we befriend such people and we become partners in the journey of yoga. When we meet someone who is innocent, that is, someone who may be in need of this knowledge that we have at least some understanding of, and who might be receptive to it, then we do our best to share our experience with them and perhaps even teach them if they express an interest in being taught. And to those who are inimical to the whole idea of self-realization, we just leave them alone. We don't really engage in a relationship with them beyond what is necessary to interact with the world, with society. So we understand that each of those people have the same spiritual standing, the same supreme person within their heart, but that doesn't mean we don't make distinctions. It doesn't mean we pretend that the cow is an elephant is a dog, and it's all just one homogeneous thing. We make intelligent distinctions, discernment, or buddhi, being able to use good judgment in our dealings with others while still having the understanding that everyone is an eternal spiritual being currently having a material experience. And then our last verse for this evening: even here in this world, those whose minds are fixed in impartiality, as I have just described, seeing all as equal, spiritual equality as opposed to some artificial material equality, or absolute literal oneness as opposed to spiritual unity in terms of our shared quality as spiritual beings. Those people conquer birth and death. So once again, not obliged to come back into the material world. As the absolute truth is flawless and forever the same, they too are established in the absolute truth. So a saintly person has godly qualities. That's how you define a saintly person. We assume that God, and reasonably so, we assume that the supreme person is kind to all, is compassionate to all, is equal to all, who sees friends and enemies as the same, even though the reciprocation may be different according to the nature of the desire of a friend or an enemy. Qualitatively, we become just like the Supreme Being. We are not quantitatively like the Supreme Being, because the Supreme Being is uniquely the Supreme Being, but because we are a part of the complete absolute reality, we share in those qualities. And as we experience the purification of the heart, the purification of our desires, as we become more and more qualified to see the highest truth, just as we can see everything around us when there is daylight, then we develop these same qualities as the absolute truth. So if you have any last questions as we head into the home stretch. Our program this evening: the results of letting go or not, how Krishna is unaffected by the actions of others, and how Krishna is also not responsible for the actions of others, ignorance and knowledge, and seeing with equal vision. The idea of desire as what we are actually able to do is we can desire, and the reason why we are accountable for the results of actions we don't perform, because it is our desire that initiates the action in the first place. If you have any questions after the fact, please send them to me, Hari@Hari-kirtana.com, or post them on the Facebook page, Bhagavad-gita Online Satsang on Facebook. Please feel free to post some things there if you so desire. Next week, we start to pivot from karma yoga to mystic yoga, finding happiness by turning inward, pratyahara. So the first of the internal practices, or the actually I'd say the sandhya, the connecting point, the juncture between external practices of yoga and internal practices of yoga is pratyahara, turning inward, and how we actually can find happiness by looking inside for the self rather than outside for the enjoyments of the senses. We'll also talk a little bit more about equanimity and indifference, and where indifference is properly applied in our yoga practice, how one, again, is assured of liberation. Krishna's going to bang on this a few times. He's already started to do it here. And he's really going to drive this point home, that liberation from material existence comes about by this process that he is describing here. Verses 20 through 26 in the 5th chapter is where we're going. All right. Thank you all very, very much for spending this portion of your evening with me. It's always a great honor to have you here, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to spend this time with you. I look forward to your questions after the fact and your posts on the Facebook page. Oh, thank you all. You are all very, very kind. All right, checking out. Be safe wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Good night.